Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. Many people know that there are similarities between Masonic ceremonies and LDS temple ceremonies. What are the similarities? What are the differences? We'll talk more about these in our next conversation with historian Cheryl Bruno. You won't want to miss this episode. Check it out. Hey, I just wanted to mention one other thing. Beyond the Blocks is an awesome podcast, and it seeks to center the narratives of the marginalized in conversations on Mormonism. A Black lifelong member and queer theologian, Brother Jones and Brother Knox seek to fill the gaps between Mormon theology and Mormon culture that find all kinds of identities may claim a seat at the table of Christ. So check out Beyond the Block. It's a great podcast. Now back to our conversation. What else can you tell us as far as these similarities without, breaking anything that we're not supposed to talk about?
Well, I like to talk about the 5 points of fellowship because this is no longer a part of the temple ceremony. But it used to be part of the temple ceremony when I first went through, and it is a Masonic ritual. And so one thing I noticed when I started learning about Freemasonry is it gave meaning to that symbol, which I never understood as a Mormon. And Masons they're able to tell you what each symbol means. Each of the 5 points has a specific meaning to the Masons, and when I learned those meanings, it made my Mormonism suddenly come alive for me.
And then they took it away.
Yeah, darn. And I find that in a lot of different things in the temple is that if you understand Freemasonry, it's not exactly borrowed from Freemasonry, but Freemasonry gives it a meaning that is broader and that helps you understand why it's there a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I know, since we mentioned that, I know, in fact, I just had a conversation with somebody, and he says, do you know why they made these changes in 1990? I know there was some big differences there, and it sounds like there are different beliefs in that. My response was, well, it was due to the God makers, and that the churches tried to kind of sever some of these Masonic elements to make it more different. Is that a fair characterization?
Well, I have a little different view, and I am a believing Mormon, so that's kind of where I'm coming from. But I feel that there are changes that they make in the temple ceremony make them more meaningful for people today. A lot of the symbols, symbolism is really important to me, and sometimes I think it's a real shame that some of those symbols are lost. But when it no longer means the same thing to people that are going through the temple, it needs to be removed. And one of these is women veiling their faces. That used to have a very different meaning to women than it does today. And today it's very oppressive. And so it needs to be taken out of the ceremony because it's seen by women now as being oppressive, and that's not what the symbol was meant to convey. So it's appropriate to change things so that the ritual now conveys something that it's meant to convey. Because society has changed, and because people change, we need to also keep up with that in our...
Well, and that's interesting that you mention that, because I know, in fact, tell me if this is a true statement, because I believe in Joseph Smith's day that in order to be a Mason, you had to be a man. You could not be a woman. Mm-hmm. And so I've heard that when Joseph introduced the endowment ceremony and he allowed women to participate, that made a lot of Masons angry because women weren't supposed to be part of this. Is that true?
No, and I wonder where that comes from, because I've tried to track down where that idea is coming from. And there is absolutely... First of all, there were women Masons in Joseph Smith's time.
Oh, really?
There were. And we believe that some of the women in Nauvoo actually were part of maybe the heroines of Jericho. There's a little bit of evidence there, which will be in my book. But I don't think it had a lot to do with anything. But the fact that Joseph was... the Grand Lodge of Illinois had a lot of different problems with things that Joseph Smith was doing, or that Masons were doing in Nauvoo. And they come out with it quite clearly. We're having a problem with this, we're having a problem with that. And never was ever said contemporaneously that they had a problem with women being brought into ritual. That was never said. It was simply not a problem for other Masons. And so I don't know when this idea started that Masons were upset that.
Well, that's interesting.
I don't know when that started, but I'd like to track that down because I think it's quite recently, that it's not, within the last 50 years or something, but it's a more recent idea.
Well, and another thing that I wanted to ask you about was, I know Michael Homer has written the book, Joseph's Temples.
Right.
I need to get Michael on. He's agreed, and I just haven't gotten to him. But I know in his book he has said that he thinks that the ban on black church members was also due to Masonic influences.
Yes, I really enjoyed his chapter in his book where he writes about that. It's kind of breaking new ground. I don't have exactly the same ideas that he does, and you'll have to compare our two books to see the differences because it's quite involved. But I think that, I admire his argument. I just don't see it the same way. I don't think that the influence, the Black Lodges didn't come into play in the United States until much later, after Joseph Smith died. So I don't think it had so much of an influence in.
So you would reject that
priesthood
idea?
ban. No, I think that started with Brigham Young, and I don't think it had anything to do with Masonry.
Oh, that's interesting.
So.
I believe that Walker Lewis, who was a Mason in Massachusetts.
Yes, he actually was a Grand Master.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that was did they have a special Black Lodge in Massachusetts?
Yes.
And so he had helped start that as well.
Yes. And some people believe that might have been some of the tension he had with Brigham Young when he later went to Utah.
Oh, really? Can you tell us more about that?
No, I don't know much about it.
Oh, okay. Well, that's too bad. All right. Can you talk a little bit more? It seems like in the early days of the church, Mormon leaders weren't, they didn't hide the Masonic temple ceremony connections. Can you talk us a little bit more about that?
No, I think they were really proud of being Masons. And the interesting thing to me is that after Joseph Smith died, they continued to make Masons at even faster a pace than when he was alive. So even though they now had the temple ceremony, the Nauvoo temple was up and running, they still continued to make Masons. And it wasn't even just a preparatory thing for the temple ceremony, because several men that we know of had their temple endowments and then were made Masons after that. So we end up with about 1,300 Masons in the Nauvoo Lodge alone, and several other, maybe 7 other Mormon lodges in the area. So who knows how many Mormon men were Masons. Maybe as many as 1 in 4 Mormon men were Masons by the time they started going over to Utah.
Okay. And so it seems like I've heard that in Utah especially, there was a little bit of animosity between Masons and Mormons.
Yes.
Why?
Brigham Young was very upset at the martyrdom. He believed that Joseph Smith had been murdered by Masons or with Masonic influence.
Well, and I understand Joseph Smith did set up a Masonic call of distress.
Well, whether he did or not is kind of up for grabs. However, the Mormons of the period believed that that's what he had been doing.
Oh, so it's not clear?
So we do have evidence. Well, the evidence we have is that several Mormons believed that's what he was doing. So, I don't think he came out with the entire Masonic call of distress, but he did do enough of it so that it was recognizable.
Do you think that he recognized Masons in the mob and was trying to save himself?
There are several different, and I'm not really sure what his motivation was for giving. I believe he was giving the Masonic call of distress, but there's several reasons he could have been doing that. There could have been Masons in the mob that he thought might help him. Or he could have known that they weren't going to help him because they were very against, the Masons in the mob would have been very against Mormon Masonry. So maybe he was just reminding them what they were doing was not Masonically correct. Or maybe he was just calling out to God with a Masonic call, because Masons believed that that was an effective, even if there was no mortal ear to hear that call, that God would hear that. So there's several reasons why he could have done that.
So would it be, can Masonry be considered a religion then?
Joe, my husband, used to say over and over again, Masonry is not a religion. They don't want to be a religion. But to me, they seem very religious in what they do. Very symbolic and very esoteric, and I believe very religious. They do believe in God and a higher being, and they take pains not to join with any particular religious organization, but they do have a strong connection with God, and the whole purpose behind being a Mason is to forge a connection with the divine being.
Because I've heard you could be a Jew, you could be a Christian, you could be a Muslim, a Hindu. It doesn't your religion doesn't matter. But whatever religion you are, you should believe in a higher being.
Right.
Could you be an atheist and be a Mason?
No.
You cannot. You have to believe in God.
Yes.
Okay. But whatever your religion is, the idea is to make you a better Jew, Christian,
right.
Mormon, whatever.
Yes.
Is that fair?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, and that's why, and I think you mentioned in Utah there was a lot of animosity between Mormons and Masons. And
so this was more over the martyrdom of Joseph.
I think that was Brigham's problem with it. Now, you have several people that came over, and like Lucius Scoville, for example, wanted to continue Masonry in Utah, but Brigham Young kind of shot that idea down because he thought that it would not work very well. And I think it's in part because he was so upset about the treatment they had received from Masons back in Illinois. But let's see, where was I going with that?
Well, I know for a long time, if you were a Mormon, you couldn't become a Mason here in Utah.
Right. And so, okay, I know where I was going with that. So it was quite strange to have that happen, because usually you will take any religion, Masonry should take any religion and make them a better Muslim, Mormon, whatever. And so for them to say, no, we're not going to have any Mormons, particularly because you are religion we don't agree with, was very un-Masonic. Okay. And so that's one of the things that later on, many years later, they said, we can't be doing this. So now there are Mormon Masons in Utah, and in fact the Grand Master of the Masonic Lodge in Utah is now a Mormon.
Oh, really?
Yes. So.
Interesting. Starting to run out of questions here. Is there anything else that I've missed here that we should talk about with regards to Masonry?
Well, one thing I think is really interesting is that even though Brigham Young did not continue Masonry in Utah, we have a lot of the other break-off groups that did continue Masonry. We look at the Strangites, and they had a temple ceremony that was very Masonic.
Oh, really?
Yes, they had almost the organization that they had was brought in from John Bennett, who had a great interest in Masonry.
And to my knowledge, there's no relation between me and John C. Bennett.
That's good. So yeah, they had a really interesting Masonic connection, which you can read about in my book as well. And then you have Alpheus.
So I didn't know the Strangites had a temple ceremony. That's interesting. And it was. Do we have any sense of how similar it was to the LDS?
We do, and it's it was very different from the LDS, but it was closer to Masonry. What they did a lot of things that remind you of the Council of the 50, and that were Masonic, because the Council of 50 was very Masonic as well. And then you have Alpheus Cutler, who they also had temples, a temple ritual that was Masonic, and then Lyman White, when he went to Texas, brought over some Masonic elements. Temple. Yeah, not necessarily in his temple ritual, but he brought some Masonic elements into his group. So you see the importance of Masonry was continued in many of these groups.
Very interesting. I didn't know anything about the Strangites. I didn't even know they had a temple. Did they have a temple?
Yeah, they did.
And so they did endowments, sealings, everything that the LDS do? Do you know? They
didn't get very far along before he was killed in that, but they did crown him as the imperial primate, and and he was crowned in much the same way as Joseph Smith was crowned in the Council of 50, and then they had a building that they were going to be using for temple. We don't know too much about what their actual ritual would be.
So did they build a temple, or they were planning to build a temple?
They were building a temple.
They were building it when he died? Okay. Very interesting. All right. Well, anything else you have?
No, that's good.
All right. Well, Cheryl Bruno, thanks again for participating here on Gospel Tangents.
Thank you.
So it's so interesting, especially because I have Dan Vogel on my head, that you're telling me that Kirtland had Masonic. I was like, what? And then
So you know what I have in my book
and
that
Council
people
of
don't.
50.
The thing about Kirtland is they had Danites.
They did?
They had Danites in Kirtland, and that's what people don't. People are going to be really shocked when they read about this in my book, because I have lots of evidence.
Well, you're supposed to give me the shocking stuff. Do I need to turn the camera back on?
We'd have to go all the way back to the Kirtland part. It doesn't fit in.
I can edit. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with historian Cheryl Bruno. So I want to encourage everybody to go out and buy her book when it comes out. Be the first one. So I'm going to be in the first in line, I'll tell you that. It's going to be a fantastic book. It's called Method Infinite, and it's by Greg Coford Books. So it should be coming out here in the next couple of months. So check it out. And Cheryl, I just want to thank you for spending so much time talking with us and learning more about your book. Really appreciate that, Cheryl. In our next conversation, I'm excited to introduce Claire Barris. He's been studying Mormon history on the internet longer than anybody I know.
To show my ancientness, I was actually online in 1984 on the internet when only engineering firms and universities were on the internet.
That's what I thought.
Very briefly, but in '88 I got on, and I've been on consistently ever since. In '88 it would take a week to get email from here to the East Coast, just to give you a sense of how primitive it was. And so, yeah, I'm an old dinosaur.
Was this like Prodigy or AOL or something else?
It was before. I remember when AOL and Prodigy came online. This was pre-anything. You had to work at an engineering firm, and some universities had access.
So like the ARPANET?
Oh, yeah, it was the ARPANET. Yeah,
Oh,
it was
wow.
it was pre-internet. It was the ARPANET.
Wow.
Yeah.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, please subscribe to patreon.com/gospeltangents. And for just $5 a month, you can hear the entire interview without any interruption. If you'd like a paperback version of our transcripts, go to Amazon.com and do a search for Gospel Tangents interview. Also, if you'd like to give the money to me and not Amazon, please subscribe on my website, and I'll be able to send you a transcript as soon as they are completed, and click the subscribe button. You can also find our latest information on Facebook.com/GospelTangents, as well as we're on Twitter @GospelTangents. And don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. The link is at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents, and you can subscribe there. Also, please give us a 5-star review. If you want to support all of the podcasts as part of the Dialogue Podcast Network, go to lyceum.fm, that's lyceum.fm, and do a search for Dialogue Podcast Network or Gospel Tangents, because, that's a pretty cool one too. Thanks again for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some of our great videos. Thanks again.